Today, I want to talk about, at least in the beginning here, I don't know if I'll do this whole thing, but I might, just do this because it does relate to New Testament archaeology, and it'll be maybe a practical thing for us. Friday morning, I drove to this kind of remote area, a podunk area of Florida called Sarasota. And yeah, that makes somebody unhappy in here. No, very nice town, very nice city. So I drove over there, got up early and drove over, and I gave a presentation, gave a paper at a thing called the Florida Conference of Historians. I was unaware of this conference of historians until I moved to Florida. I just was kind of Googling around one time, maybe the first year I was here, and just happened across this thing. It said Florida Conference of Historians, and I thought, what is that? So I wrote to them and I said, now is this a conference of Florida historians, or is this a conference of, in other words, is this a conference about Florida, like Florida History Conference, or is this like historians who happen to live in Florida conference? In other words, I wanted to know what was the scope of the conference. And they came back and said, oh no, this is for any time period, any area, you're welcome to submit a paper proposal. And so I didn't do it last year, but this year, last fall, I submitted a proposal. So it's probably good just to tell you how this works. So I happened to see it on a website. I didn't know about this group. I submitted a proposal. They accepted my proposal. I had to give them like a paragraph of what I was going to talk about, who I was and where I taught and all that kind of stuff. Then he wrote back and said, yes, we're pleased to inform you your paper has been accepted. And this particular conference moves from place to place. It does not always in the same location every year. And from what I can gather, it moves from one college campus to another. And it's on a Friday and a Saturday, okay? So in this case, it was at New College in Sarasota. I think it's called Sarasota still. Yeah, Sarasota. So, which is right next to the Ringling. You've heard of probably Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, right? Yeah, well, I haven't gone to it myself, but the Ringling, one of the Ringling guys, Ringling Brothers, I guess, had a big estate there, big house. And so that's right next door, and a big chunk of the property for this college is part of that estate. And so they built it there about, let's say, roughly 100 years ago. About 100 years ago, they built this big estate. The guy's wife, his name was John Ringling. Can't remember his wife's name. She was kind of in charge of building their mansion, or at least sort of, I don't think she physically built it herself, but she had, like the design of it, what she wanted. She told them what she wanted, and of course they had pretty much unlimited money at that point. They spent like, of course, like 1910, they spent like $3 million on the place, which was unheard of. And it was right on the water. It's right on the Gulf of Mexico. So her image was that was going to be like Venice. This is like the Grand Canal. And they were going to make like one of these Italian, Venetian mansions. So it's pretty impressive. And there was another building on there. So part of that, the museum, there's a big art museum there now, and there's this mansion, and there's some other stuff. Now that stuff technically is not under the control of the college. It's controlled separately. But one of the houses next to it where we had our banquet, very nice, was a part of that and is sort of under the domain of the college, which goes right out to the water. You can walk right out. Look right out the big windows and see the Gulf out there. So, So pretty amazing. And then what happens when this Ringling, he and his wife bought a bunch of art, paintings and different statues and different things while they were traveling Europe, I guess as he wanted to do. And he would bring it home. Well, he got so much stuff, he didn't have room for all this in his house. So he actually built a separate building, a museum, I guess a private, like his own museum, which has now been expanded somewhat. But when he died, he hit on financial hard times. Can't imagine why, spending money pretty on a house and art and building a museum and so forth. He's spending a lot of dough. But then I think the Depression came and it kind of hit him on hard times. His wife died, then the Depression came, and then he decided he was going to leave his property to the state of Florida, which he did. So he left his entire estate, and of course there were some bills also. So when the state got this, they had, and in the house had kind of gotten somewhat run down because he couldn't keep it up. And then the state had to figure out what they were going to do with all this. So anyway, that's how the college property got started there. And they expanded that museum, and so now it's the State Museum. It's one of the finest art museums in Florida, from what I understand. And there is a small circus museum there too. I did not go into that. But, and then there's this estate. So basically now tourists come, typically they would go to the art museum, they'd probably go to the circus museum, and then they would go into that big mansion and make a day of it, right? Spend a day at the Ringling estate, okay? So I gave my paper. There were a lot of sessions there. I've got the program here. As you can see, 59th annual. Next year it's up in, it's up north. Let's see, what does it say? Florida Gateway College. You heard of that? In Lake City. That's where it is next year. So I'll have to decide if I'm going or not. But yeah, I enjoyed it. And I found out that there are papers here by undergrads, graduate students, and professors. So they are wide open, and it could be any topic of history. So this is the paper. This is what I presented. You see on the screen. And it relates to our course because it is about archaeology and it is about research that is done. So I thought this might be a good example, good opportunity. It's fresh in my mind, and this is kind of one of the things that archaeologists do. Not digging, but you have to share your research. You have to, you dig, but then there's just all kinds of paperwork. As some of you are learning, working on this shell midden, right? We have things to wash, a lot of shells to wash for one thing, pottery, and so forth, and it generates a piece of paper or more for each little pit that we made. And I still have to go through and process a lot of that paperwork. And then what you have to do is find comparisons, comparing this to another, where else have they found this kind of pottery? Where else have they found this kind of arrowhead or projectile point? Where else are there shell middens? How else do people determine they were used? Well, the same kind of thing goes on in the Middle East, same kind of thing goes on here. So, here you see my title screen about Nabateans on the Karak Plateau, evidence from the Karak Resources Project. Then my name, and then the name of the conference. All right, first thing then is, where is Karak? Well, that's a good thing to know. Here is a map then that shows you the modern country of Jordan, as well as the Israel, Syria, and so forth. All familiar territories to me. So you can see By the way, that place I was just talking about, Ajloon, is right about there. Right near the eye in Irbid. Okay. Looking out over the Jordan Valley. And Abila is way up here, north of Irbid, near the Syrian border and the Golan Heights. Okay, so that's that gives you some perspective there. So you can see it. Here's where Abila is. Here's Irbid. Here's Ajloon. But you go way down here. Here's the Dead Sea. Here's Amman, the capital. Here is Al-Karak. Now there is a plateau down here, and there are two big rivers that go here, and that's where I've been working. So the focus of this paper then is to look at really archaeological surveys. What is an archaeological survey? Well, when I talk about archaeological surveys, I'm talking about the process whereby we don't dig. We just survey. That is, we walk across the ground, the surface. We pick up whatever we find that has been worked by humans. All right? So this could be, a shell casing. This could be a piece of pottery. This could be a worked stone. Whatever we find. And typically what you can do, there's different ways to do it. But let's say you make a 10 by 10 meter grid. 10 by 10 meters. That's a pretty good sized square. And then in that 10 by 10 meter grid, you put two people. And you let those two people walk around it for half an hour. Now you've got 1 man hour in a 10 by 10 meter square to pick up whatever you can find. And we put it in a bucket, put it in a bag, and then we mark it. Okay, that's a survey grid, whatever, and we mark the GPS coordinates of it, and then we move on to the next one. Okay? Sometimes you could do these in a line. Sometimes you could do them somewhat at random. Depends on how you are doing your survey. And then what you would do is take all that stuff back. You'd wash it, clean it up, look at it closely, and you can begin to see the idea here is what you find on the surface is an indication of what lies beneath. Why? Because of erosion, rain, other things like that. Because of animal activity. Some people say, well, how does that pottery get up on the ground? Well, for example, those of you who have been out to the site along the Kissimmee River that we've been working, when I first went there and they asked me to come, I went by myself to look it over. They took me out there and they showed me the area, and the first thing I noticed was pottery. How was I seeing the pottery? You remember there's those holes that are there. Those are animal burrows. Found out later they're turtles.
Gopher tortoises.
What's that?
They're gopher tortoises.
A gopher tortoise, which tastes better than turtle. I've tried both. But they dig, and as they're digging, they throw the dirt out the front, and they're digging up pottery, and some shells and stuff like that. So I gathered some of that stuff. So I did a little surface survey, I guess you'd say. And then I determined, okay, this is a good place to try to investigate. And then we went back and dig. Well, in Jordan, of course, you find typically a lot more pottery than you would find here in the United States. And these surveys were done. The first one was done by a guy named Nelson Glick. Nelson Glick was a guy that lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, Jewish. He taught at a rabbinic school. In fact, he was a president of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and a well-known archaeologist. He came there and did a whole survey of the area. Miller Pinkerton was a group of a team that worked here in the late 70s, early 80s. I don't know, 78 to 82, I don't know, something like that. And then, of course, the Karak Resources Project, which I was a part of, we began actually in the mid-90s, And we just ended about 5 years ago. Okay, but we had a hiatus in there after 9/11. All right, and so what I'm doing is I'm just taking a look at what we found in the survey. So I'm not looking at everything we found. What we found in the survey and comparing it to the other surveys, and I'm just interested trying to identify Nabatean. So here is a map that shows us Moab. You can see Karak in the center, right? You can see a wadi to the north, river valley. You see that valley up here? They call this the Grand Canyon of Jordan. It's the Mujib. But biblical times, you know, the Bible, have you ever heard of that, the Bible? It's called the Arnon. And to the south, they call it the Hessa, Wadi al-Hessa. But in the biblical times, they called that the Zered. So we actually have permission to work on this entire plateau, from the desert out here to the valley, up and down. Now, mostly what we worked on was down in this area, down here. Actually, we worked kind of from Karak south. From Karak south. Now, one thing I do want to point out, do you see this valley here, this kind of line? You see that? That's actually a valley. And turns out that's a very important valley for our work. Okay. Well, the next thing is, I'm talking about Nabateans. Who are Nabateans? Well, Nabateans are Arabs. They're early Arabs who lived in Arabia, in Jordan. If you've ever seen a guy named Indiana Jones, and I hope you have, and if you've ever seen what I think arguably is the best of the Indiana Jones films, I mean, the first one's hard to beat, but I like the third one, The Last Crusade. Be hard for me to pick, but I think I'd probably pick the third one as my favorite, and then the first one, and then probably the second one. I wasn't a big fan of the second one. And then the fourth one, no, I was not much of a fan at all, the fourth one. But that's just me. Of course, any Indiana Jones film comes out, I'm going to go watch it. But I hear there's maybe one more. There may be one more out there. If Harrison Ford can stay alive, we can make one more. Well, so Diodorus. Now, this is another thing we have to do. When you have, if you're digging where there are written records, we don't have much written records of what's going on over there near the Kissimmee River. That would be nice, but we don't. But here we have Diodorus, who writes, this land is situated, that is Arabia, between Syria and Egypt, divided amongst many people of diverse nature, in the eastern parts inhabited by Arabs, who bear the name of Nabateans, and range over a country which is partially desert and partly waterless, though a small section is fruitful. Okay, these are the Nabateans. Arabs, by the way, are mentioned all the way back to Herodotus, at least in the 5th century. I don't know if that's the earliest reference, but they certainly were not new then. And they come to dominate, the Nabateans dominate the trade, cross-desert trade, from about 200 BC to 100 AD. About 150, 200 years, or almost 300 years. So who were the Nabateans? There's a real problem with this. The Nabateans, people are still kind of debating. Who are they? What are they? I'm just calling them pre-Islamic Arabs. But the term Nabatean, as Graff has noted, and by the way, Graff teaches at the University of Miami in Florida, has been there for a long time, and has really kind of specialized in this area. He said, should be understood as a vast political alliance of various peoples. Rosenthal Higginbottom said, the Nabateans never formed an ethnic identity, nor a nation or state. In the modern sense, their civilization was a conglomerate of Bedouin nomadic tradition and Hellenistic urban society. And in fact, it is this dichotomy of Bedouinism and Hellenism that is its characteristic feature. So I give you references where I got this information. if you want to pursue it more. Problem, of course, of sources. We don't have much written Nabatean sources. We don't have Nabatean archives or Kings Chronicles of the Nabatean kings. We do know there were Nabatean kings because we can sort of develop a list of Nabatean kings based upon some inscriptions and a few references. For example, we have one Nabatean king mentioned in the New Testament. Anybody know where or who? In what context? The New Testament, by the way, is in the Bible. It's that part that's towards the end of most Bibles. Of course, now nobody owns a Bible. They just like Google it or something. So if you Google or whatever, you use your apps. Yeah, go ahead.
Would it be Herod the Great?
Not Herod. Herod is, yeah, he's an Idumean, not a Nabatean. Yeah, I can see why you'd say that. Yeah. No, not, but that's a good guess. It's actually in the book of Acts, and it deals with the Apostle Paul. Early on, I guess maybe you might say before he's even an apostle, but his name has been changed. He's in Damascus. And he mentioned the ruler of Damascus is a guy named Aretas. I believe he's Aretas the Fourth. So you can look him up. But he is a Nabatean king. And we do have kings that are on coins and other things like that. But most of what we have, we have coins, we have other things. We have inscriptions like the one you see on the screen here that are short inscriptions. They're mostly funerary inscriptions written in Nabatean, which is an early form of Arabic. And our other sources are, say, coins. Certainly we have pottery, we have architecture, and other evidence. So this other evidence is important for us as well. These are Nabatean coins, by the way, from a coin hoard. The most famous, I mentioned Indiana Jones to let you know that if you've watched the third or the Last Crusade, the third movie, pivotal in that movie is Indiana Jones, right, along with his father, the other Dr. Jones, and another guy, Salah. They're all on horses, and they are heading into a gorge, and they come to the end, and you see this cliff rising, and you see this building, and then eventually they go in there. Indiana Jones goes in there, and he meets up with a knight. You remember that? I don't want to spoil the movie for you if you haven't seen it now, some 30 years after it was made. Spoiler alert, he meets a knight in there, and he's looking for the Holy Grail. That's what The Last Crusade's about. Now I've probably wrecked the whole movie. Anyway, but that place that he goes into, it looks like a building, is really not a building. It's a facade, and it's at Petra. And it was actually a tomb. So they go into, you hang on a minute there. They go in there and, he has to choose the chalice. Well, that is Petra. That's the capital of the Nabateans. Well, I guess we have to leave it there.